I watched my father lift his wine glass with the kind of smile he only wore when he thought he'd beaten someone. Around our Thanksgiving table, the conversation faded as he tapped his fork against the crystal. "Well," he said proudly, "I suppose it's finally official. We sold your grandmother's beach house." A few relatives clapped politely. Then his eyes settled on me. "And before anyone asks," he added with a smirk, "Mariam was never in the will anyway." My brother Evan chuckled. "Good," he said. "She would have wasted the money trying to keep that old place." No one defended me. My aunt stared down at her plate. My cousins suddenly found the mashed potatoes fascinating. The silence hurt more than the words. I reached for my wine, took one slow sip, set the glass back on the table. "Nice," I said calmly. "Hope you enjoyed the sale." Dad leaned back, looking pleased with himself. "Oh, we did." I nodded once. "I'm glad." Then I looked him straight in the eye. "I'm the one who bought it." The room froze. My father's smile disappeared so quickly it was almost frightening. Evan laughed once, expecting everyone else to join him. Nobody did. The only sound left was the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway. Dad slowly lowered his glass onto the table. "What did you just say?" I had imagined this moment dozens of times. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I knew exactly how my father worked. Richard Collins never believed quiet people were capable of surprising him. If you didn't argue, he assumed you'd surrendered. If you didn't brag, he assumed you had nothing worth mentioning. My entire life he'd mistaken my silence for weakness. That Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be his victory lap. Instead, it became the first time everyone in the family realized they hadn't known the whole story. 3 months earlier, everyone believed my grandmother's beach house would eventually belong to my father. After all, he was her only son. He repeated that fact so often it had become accepted as truth long before any legal papers were read. Even after Grandma passed away, he walked through the house giving instructions to contractors before anyone had finished grieving. "I'll probably repaint this room. We'll replace that old deck. The buyers will love the ocean view." Every sentence assumed ownership. Whenever I suggested waiting until everything was finalized, he'd wave me off. "Don't worry about it, Mariam. This is adult business." I'd learned years earlier that arguing with him never changed anything. So I stopped arguing. I simply listened. And I started paying attention. Now, sitting across from him at Thanksgiving, I watched certainty drain from his face for the very first time. He stared at me as though I'd spoken another language. "What did you just say?" Dad's question hung over the table, but my mind drifted back to the months before Grandma passed away. Long before anyone was talking about buyers or closing dates, I was making the 2-hour drive to her beach house every Saturday morning. She would already be waiting on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. "You still spoil me," she'd say with a smile. "I learned from the best," I'd answer. The house wasn't perfect anymore. Salt air had worn down the paint, the porch railing needed reinforcing, the plumbing had developed its usual stubborn leaks. Grandma worried about every repair. I never let her. "If it keeps the house standing, it's worth it," I'd tell her as I scheduled another contractor or picked up supplies from the hardware store. She always offered to reimburse me. I always refused. "This place has taken care of our family for decades," I said once while replacing loose deck boards. "It deserves someone to take care of it now." She smiled but didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the ocean. "You know who else comes here?" she asked quietly. I already knew the answer. "Dad." She nodded. "He doesn't ask how I'm feeling anymore." "What does he ask?" She sighed. "How much the houses next door are selling for." I stopped working. She wasn't joking. "The last 3 visits," she continued, "he spent more time talking about property values than sitting with me." I tried to defend him. "Maybe he's just planning ahead." Grandma looked at me with sad, knowing eyes. No, sweetheart, he's planning after. The words stayed with me the entire drive home. A few weeks later, her health declined rapidly. During one hospital visit, she reached for my hand. There's something I need to do while I still can. The next afternoon, her attorney came to the hospital. I waited outside the room while they met privately. About 20 minutes later, the attorney stepped into the hallway. Grandma smiled at me through the partially open door, but neither of them explained what they'd discussed. I didn't ask. If Grandma wanted me to know, she would tell me when she was ready. She passed away peacefully 2 weeks later. The funeral had barely ended before Dad gathered everyone in Grandma's living room. "We should move quickly," he said. "The market is still strong." I stared at him. "We haven't even finished sorting through her personal things." He dismissed the comment with a wave of his hand. "Sentiment doesn't pay property taxes." Over the next several days, he spoke with real estate agents, arranged inspections, and acted as though every decision belonged to him alone. Each time I questioned the rush, he gave the same answer. "Everything's already handled." There was something unsettling about how confident he sounded. It was as if he knew something the rest of us didn't. A few days later, Grandma's attorney called and asked me to stop by his office. When I arrived, he closed the door behind us before speaking. He folded his hands across his desk and looked directly at me. "Your grandmother left one instruction she specifically said should remain confidential until the time was right." I felt my pulse quicken. The attorney slid a thin folder onto his desk, but kept his hand resting on it. "I can only tell you part of what your grandmother arranged today," he said. "The rest cannot be disclosed until certain legal conditions have been satisfied." I frowned. "I don't understand." She anticipated conflict over the beach house. That didn't surprise me. "What she created," he continued, "was completely legal and fully enforceable. Before the property could be sold to an outside buyer, one specific person would have the first opportunity to purchase it under the same terms." "Whose?" He shook his head. "I'm not permitted to answer that yet." I left his office with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Dad acted as though he had already won. Within days, a real estate sign appeared in front of Grandma's beach house. Professional photographers filled the rooms. An open house was scheduled before most of Grandma's belongings had even been sorted. At Sunday dinner a week later, Dad couldn't stop talking about it. "The market's incredible," he announced. "We'll have multiple offers before the month's over." Evan grinned. "About time this family stopped treating that place like a museum." He glanced at me. "You planning to make an offer?" A few people laughed. Dad answered before I could. "With what money?" The table chuckled again. I smiled politely and kept eating. The less I said, the more convinced they became that I had accepted losing the house. That assumption became my greatest advantage. The following Monday, I met quietly with the attorney again. This time, he handed me the documents Grandma had authorized him to release. As I read them, I realized why she'd been so calm during our final conversations. She had already thought several moves ahead. I contacted my bank that afternoon. The approval process wasn't easy. Even with years of careful saving and a stable career as a financial analyst, buying beachfront property meant extensive financial reviews, appraisals, and paperwork. For weeks, my evenings disappeared into meetings with lenders, accountants, and attorneys. No one outside those rooms knew what I was doing. On my attorney's advice, the purchase would be made through a newly formed limited liability company. Its name revealed nothing about me. If the transaction became emotional before it closed, everything Grandma had planned could become far more complicated. So I stayed silent. Every time Dad bragged about interested buyers, I simply nodded. Every time Evan joked about spending his share of the proceeds, I changed the subject. Then one afternoon my attorney called. The seller has accepted the highest offer. I smiled. Has he figured it out? A quiet laugh came through the phone. Not even close. 2 weeks later, every signature had been completed. The funds had transferred. The deed had been recorded. Legally, the beach house was mine. Dad never suspected that the anonymous buyer he praised to everyone was sitting across from him at family dinners. By Thanksgiving morning, he was practically glowing with pride. As dessert was served that evening, he lifted his glass for one final announcement. We finally closed the sale. He smiled directly at me, completely unaware that he was congratulating himself for selling Grandma's beach house to me. I'm the one who bought it. No one moved. My father blinked twice, as though his mind refused to process the sentence. Then he laughed. That's not funny. I wasn't trying to be funny. Evan leaned forward, resting both elbows on the table. Seriously, Mariam, cut it out. I looked at him. I am serious. Dad shook his head. There's no way. Do you know what that property sold for? Yes. You couldn't afford it. Instead of answering, I reached beside my chair and picked up the leather folder I'd brought with me. I had debated bringing it. Part of me hoped I wouldn't need it, but another part knew my father too well. I placed the folder gently on the table. Dad frowned. What is that? The closing documents. I opened the folder and slid several neatly organized pages toward him. They're copies. He barely glanced at them before pushing them back. I don't need paperwork. I know who bought the house. No, I said quietly. You know the name of the company that bought it. Evan grabbed the documents before Dad could stop him. He scanned the first page. Harbour Legacy Holdings. He looked confused. Who's Harbour Legacy Holdings? I answered without raising my voice. I am. The room filled with murmurs. What? You own it. When? How? My aunt leaned closer to read the documents herself. My cousin pulled out his reading glasses. Even the relatives who had stayed silent all evening suddenly wanted to see every page. Dad's face slowly lost its color. This is fake. It isn't. You forged these. I couldn't. He stared at me. The purchase went through a licensed real estate brokerage, I said. It was handled by an independent title company. The financing came through my bank. Every document was reviewed by attorneys before closing. The deed has already been recorded with the county. Nobody interrupted. The sale was completed legally. Dad looked from one page to another, as if the words might rearrange themselves. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. Evan flipped through the remaining pages. The dates. He looked at Dad. The closing happened 2 weeks ago. Dad snatched the paperwork from him. You tricked me. I met his eyes for the first time all evening. No, you hid this. I followed Grandma's legal instructions. The sentence landed harder than anything else I'd said. Several relatives exchanged puzzled looks. My Aunt Linda finally spoke. What legal instructions? The room became quiet again. She looked at me instead of my father. Mariam, why would your grandmother arrange something like this? I slowly closed the folder. Because she knew exactly what would happen after she was gone. Dad slammed his palm against the table. Don't you dare put words in your grandmother's mouth. Without responding, I reached into the folder one last time. From inside, I removed a sealed envelope with Grandma's familiar handwriting across the front. Richard Collins. To be opened only after the sale is complete. Dad's expression changed instantly. He recognized the handwriting before anyone else did. My fingers rested on the envelope for a moment before I gently slid it across the table toward him. Then I broke the silence. This is the document Grandma never wanted you to see until today. No one reached for the pumpkin pie anymore. The only thing anyone looked at was the envelope resting in front of my father. His hands hovered over it, but he didn't touch it. Open it, Aunt Linda said quietly. Dad swallowed hard before breaking the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and a notarized document attached behind it. His eyes moved across the first few lines. Then they stopped. His face drained of what little color he had left. What does it say? Evan asked. Dad didn't answer. I reached across the table. May I? For the first time in my life, my father didn't argue. He simply handed me the letter. I unfolded it carefully. Even seeing Grandma's handwriting again made my chest tighten. I took a slow breath and began reading aloud. If you're hearing this letter, it means Richard has already sold my beach house. Several relatives exchanged uneasy glances. I love all of my family, but I know my son well enough to believe he will see this home as a financial opportunity before he sees it as a family legacy. Dad closed his eyes. Grandma's words continued. The beach house has never been my greatest asset. The memories inside it are. I paused for a moment before continuing. Mariam has cared for this home when no one else volunteered. She repaired what was broken, visited without being asked, and never once discussed what the property was worth. Across the table, Evan lowered his head. I created a legal first-right purchase agreement so that if Mariam wished to preserve this home, she would have the opportunity to do so before it left our family. I instructed my attorney to keep this confidential until the sale was complete because I feared interference. The room was silent. No one questioned the letter. It explained everything. I folded it carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. I didn't fight Dad, I said softly. I didn't try to stop the sale. I simply followed Grandma's wishes exactly as she planned them. Dad stared at the table. I thought, he whispered. You thought I couldn't do it, I finished. He didn't deny it. Evan rubbed the back of his neck. I made fun of you. You did. I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. For the first time in years, it sounded sincere. Around the table, the mood had completely changed. The relatives who had remained silent while I was being humiliated now understood why I had never argued. I hadn't needed to. Grandma had already protected me. Aunt Linda finally looked at my father. You embarrassed your own daughter over something your mother specifically planned. No one defended him. Not even Evans. Dad leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking much older than he had an hour earlier. I thought Mother trusted me. I shook my head gently. She loved you. I let the words settle before adding the rest. But love isn't the same as trust. No one had anything to say after that. Over the following months, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Once taxes, commissions, legal fees, and estate expenses were paid, there was far less money left from the sale than Dad and Evan had expected. The fortune they had celebrated never really existed. The beach house, however, did. It belonged to me. I hired local craftsmen to restore the weathered porch instead of replacing it. Grandma's flower garden was replanted exactly the way she liked it. The old rocking chair overlooking the ocean stayed on the front porch. Every Thanksgiving after that, I opened the beach house to family members who came to celebrate Grandma's memory instead of her property's value. Some accepted the invitation. Others didn't. Dad called several times during that first year. Eventually, I agreed to meet him at the house. He stood on the porch for a long time before speaking. It looks just like she left it. That was the point. He nodded. There was no argument. No excuses. Just silence filled with things that should have been said years earlier. When he left, I watched him walk down the same path Grandma used to wave from every afternoon. I realized I wasn't holding on to the house because it was worth millions. I was holding on because it reminded me what real inheritance looks like. That Thanksgiving, my father thought he'd won by selling Grandma's house. In the end, all he really sold was the illusion that he had ever been the one in control.